Well, there we go. Greetings, everyone. My name is Tim Kais, and welcome to God Save the King. And per semi-usual, here's my good friend Michael Parker joining us from the left coast. By the way, in case you guys didn't know, I'm on the East Coast, and Michael is on the West Coast. So we have a lot of fun doing this via, online. Thank God for technology, which allows us to do this. So let's cover a little bit of business first, of course, right away. Things that the disclaimers that we have to make, and let you know how you can find God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network. You can listen to God Save the King every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on the Truth Be Told radio network. You can simply go to their website and click on the big listen button. But you also have, your Android app, you have MyTuner, Wi-Fi radio, and TuneIn radio. You can listen there. You can also listen, of course, on Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices, as well as being able to dial in on your phone. If you call 641-471-2866 or 717-567-4977, you will be dialed into the Truth Be Told radio network, and you can listen to God Save the King that way. And certainly, last but not least, we should mention the fact that the opinions given by me and or my guests and co-hosts and things like that are not necessarily the views of the Truth Be Told radio network. So, Michael, how are you today, my friend?
I am doing good, and a pleasure to be back. And I couldn't be with you last week. I had an interview on another show, but I'm glad to be back. And I wanted to bring up that we are approaching the holiday season again. We just had the autumnal equinox.
Yep, absolutely.
And so it got me to thinking. In previous discussions that you and I have had, you talked about the idea that when you begin to discover and realize and acknowledge or take on the understanding that Jesus Christ was not born on December 25th, at that point, I think you said that you used the word mistake. I think that's a little too strong. It's just, you're formalizing what you thought happened. But anyway, you said that you thought at that point you made a mistake, that by changing the date, it wouldn't so much change the story. Yet now we know that it changes it quite a bit. But I guess I would like for you to tell me and the listeners, as you made that understanding, was that a sudden realization? Did it just unfold logically, or how did that happen?
Well, kind of all of the above. So when I say mistake, I definitely am using that word tongue in cheek, right?
Yes.
Because part of what happened is a little bit of background here, that up until I just did a post, as a matter of fact, last week's episode, okay, that I did solo, right? Last week episode, I subtitled Schurer's Folly. Okay, now that's named for Emil Schurer, who was a very preeminent German theologian in the 19th century. And he wrote this massive book, volume of books, several volumes, entitled the Jewish people in the time of Jesus Christ, right? So he talks about Jewish culture in the time of Jesus. And he looked at the birth of Christ, and one of the things that he said was that he believed that the eclipse that is mentioned by Josephus to date the death of Herod the Great, he believed that that eclipse occurred in 4 BC, and that therefore Jesus had to have been born earlier than 4 BC. Now, so if you're not familiar with that, go back and listen to last week's episode, because I go into detail about that. But the reason I'm bringing that up is because prior to that time, the bulk of theologians and historians believed that Jesus died believe that Herod died. Make sure I say that correctly. They believe that Herod died in 1 BC, and that therefore Jesus was born in either 2 or 3 BC. So that was actually the conventional wisdom until the late 19th century. And then with Emil Schurer publishing his magnum opus, the Jewish people in the time of Jesus Christ, and saying that, okay, I don't think he was born in 2 or 3 BC. I think he was born earlier than 4 BC. that was accepted almost without argument, and it went on to be cited and in Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias and all kinds of things for about 60 years before anybody gave it a second thought, right? And then it was in the 1960s and 70s that American biblical scholars, and I'm sure others too, started to go, wait a second. Aren't we limiting the scope of our investigation? Because couldn't there have been other eclipses, right? Now, I didn't really mean to go into that much detail about that, but it sets up this point, which is that I was introduced to this theory in the mid 1980s. And at the time, we've talked about this before, the book that introduced me to it was called The Burst of Christ Recalculated by Ernest Martin. And then, so he published that in 1980, right? And then he edited it, rewrote it, and then re-released it under a different title in the mid 90s called The Star That Astonished the World. But the point being is that in the mid 1980s, a lot of people were introduced to the theory, the hypothesis that Jesus was not born on December 25th because of this book. And what happened is because we were so inundated with the traditional nativity story at that time, what we assumed, okay, which is my mistake, okay, that I say in air quotes and with my tongue firmly implanted in my cheek, the mistake that I made and that others like me made was that while we were starting to recognize that the date changed, we kind of just generally assumed that the story really didn't change all that much. And your question is fabulous, because what did happen is that once we realized that the date changed, certain components of the traditional nativity story had to be corrected because the date was different. And then over time, so the answer to your question was both and, meaning that on one hand, it was like it slapped me upside the head that I went, oh my God, the story is no different. This story is completely different. But that stark realization, frankly, came after years and years and years of research and realizing, oh my word, no, it wasn't a cold winter's night, for example. That's just one example, that we can point to right away, is that, well, he wasn't born in the winter, he was born in the fall. So unfortunately, all of our Christmas carols that celebrate it being cold aren't correct.
To the astute observer who would be following your work, and when I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that in the 80s, you're talking about there was this interest and research that was going on the correct time of Christ's birth. Gosh, I don't think that I'm a uneducated man, but I was not even aware of this until I met you.
Right.
Maybe I had just not looked in the right places, or maybe it had just not come up in conversation, but I certainly didn't know about it. But I guess one of the questions that one might ask, well, Tim, you explain it pretty well, but yes, I mean, winter's one season of four. So if it didn't happen at December 25th, yes, it would change things radically if it were, say, in summer, or it were in spring, or it were in fall. So we've talked in earlier episodes where you tell us that this did happen in September, and you have a list of 10 misconceptions. So let's talk about some of the misconceptions that just happened to do with the fact that it happened in fall as opposed to winter.
Well, number one, you've got the weather, right? And you do have the change in seasons. Now, correspondingly, we do have to mention the latitude that Jerusalem / Bethlehem is at. You see, because that's another common misconception. See, let's jump forward 1,000 years and talk about how nativity scenes became popularized. Nativity dramas were included in church services. I don't know exactly when the first one was, but by the time you hit the Middle Ages, by the time you hit the 13th century, they were included in church celebrations, certainly in the Roman Catholic Mass, but they tended to be performed by clergy and they were very formal and kind of stuffy and things like that. But then it was St. Francis of Assisi who is the man who is generally credited with popularizing the nativity scene, especially a living nativity scene, because what he did is based upon what he knew, which, see, he was probably inundated in the traditional story at that point as well, but based upon what he knew, he got some local actors, he got a bunch of animals, made a makeshift stable and a manger, and got a wax figurine for the baby Jesus and did a play. Okay, well, that's what you do. But because he was European, one of the things we pick up on right away is the fact that, and once he did it, once he did the first nativity play, they spread throughout Europe like wildfire. As a result of that, they became very, very popular, and this notion of a living nativity scene with actors and animals and stuff became very, very popular. But they were clearly looking at it through a European viewfinder. There's just no question that this is what they were doing. You have all kind of medieval and Renaissance art placing the birth date not only in December, but placing it in an environment where it clearly would snow. Okay, which it certainly can snow in Bethlehem. That's possible, but it is really quite unusual. I mean, you can go on the internet and you can type in snow in Bethlehem, and sure enough, you'll pop up pictures. So it's not that it's impossible by any stretch of the imagination, but it is unusual. So let's put it in perspective. Bethlehem is at the same north latitude. I forget exactly how many degrees north latitude it is off the top of my head, but it's at the same north latitude as like El Paso, Texas, or Ensenada, Mexico, right? And then similar to like Ensenada, I mean, Bethlehem is only 40 miles, about 35 miles from the Mediterranean Sea, right? So it's not like it's super far inland, and it's also not at great elevation. So at that latitude in September, it's usual. You see, and there you go. So we're taking away from December, right? Because I don't have to disprove that there wasn't snow on the ground anymore because it's not December, right?
Right.
So, but like I said, we were talking about this very European point of view, that they looked at it not only as being in December, but from a very, very, very European standpoint. And so therefore, the first Noel, the Christmas carol, the first Noel says, on a cold winter's night that was so deep. And I'm really sorry to say that just wasn't true, because it wasn't in the winter and it wasn't cold. It was probably extremely pleasant outside, being September at that latitude. I mean, it easily could have been 90 degrees outside, and certainly in the 70s or 80s, during the day, and then in the 50s and 60s at night.
It's interesting that St. Francis of Assisi is one of the people that kind of made this popular. And correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't he kind of the patron saint of animals? Wasn't that kind of his shtick as well?
See, right. Actually, yeah, good point. Because see, so not only was it a very European point of view, but to be blunt, a lot of his personal views got involved as well, because he is Saint Francis, right? The Franciscan order is named after him. Okay. And one of the attributes of the Franciscan order is they swear a vow of poverty. Okay. And they take that from one of the occasions the story goes that Saint Francis was at a particular mass where the gospel was read, and it was taken note that, Jesus during his earthly ministry, didn't necessarily walk around with, cash flowing out of his pockets. Right. So they took that to mean that he was impoverished, which I don't want to rabbit trail that, but that's not necessarily true. Okay. Yeah, he may not have been rolling in money, but also he certainly had enough money to fund the mission of him and his 12 apostles. Okay. There's no indication that they ever lacked for their needs. Right. So that's another story for another time. But the point being is that St. Francis took upon himself the belief that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus were very poor. Right? That they were impoverished. And then, of course, that became part of the nativity story, is that they were impoverished. Right? And now when you're talking about the Nativity, as opposed to Jesus's public ministry when he was an adult, I can tell you for certain they were not impoverished. It's just not the case. Now, Joseph wouldn't have been rich. Joseph, his adopted father, wouldn't have been rich because Herod, the Roman appointed king of Judea, did engage in confiscatory taxation. I mean, the tax rate was exorbitant. So whatever Joseph money would have made, he would have had to have paid in taxes, and that would have been just insane. But we're often told that Joseph and therefore Jesus were carpenters, right? Well, in the Greek, that's the Greek word teknon, and the Greek word teknon means a builder. I mean, it's one of the root words where we get the word architect. Okay, it's the same. It's one of the roots. Okay, which means they would have been skilled in all of the building materials of Judea, not just making furniture, which is the very stereotypical point of view that we get. They would have been builders. They would have more likely been building houses, not tables and chairs.
Essentially middle class.
Yeah, very middle class. And then also when you plug in other features of the story, because Joseph, right? See, I'm of the opinion that Joseph was most likely born and raised in Nazareth and lived his whole life in Nazareth. Now, this is contrary to the traditional nativity story, which tells us a little bit about Joseph, but that comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James, which I think is completely untrustworthy as a historical source. So my theory is that Joseph was born and raised in Nazareth, and that he learned his trade from his father, because that was typically how it was done. So it stands to reason that Joseph's father was also a builder, but the Roman city of Sepphoris was 4 miles to the northwest of Nazareth. And there would have, and especially under Herod, because Herod was a prolific builder, there would have been a ton of work in Sepphoris. They would never have lacked for work. All they would have had, they got to hoof it for 4 miles, but still, there would have been a ton of work available to them. They would have been well paid for what they did. Then they would have had to have dealt with Herod's confiscatory taxation.
The fact that St. Francis of Assisi was doing this nativity story in the 13th century remind me, because we've covered this in other programs. When was the first letter that mentioned the idea that it was December 25th? I believe, was that 5th century?
No, that was in the it would have been in the early 3rd century, so right around like 210 or 215 AD, and I'm pretty sure the first one was Hippolytus of Rome. That's the earliest written record we have of a mention of a possible December 25th birth date. I'm pretty sure it's Hippolytus of Rome. His commentary on Daniel, I believe, and right around 210, 215 AD.
So that's quite a long time before St. Francis of Assisi. And then St. Francis of Assisi takes a little bit of editorial
artistic license
with the depiction. Right. And, and he does apparently have a great love for animals. And of course there were animals and pack animals and beasts of burden, but you could see how a man, given what you said about his own personal ways of life, he created a scene that looked logical to him. And let me throw this in there as well. You mentioned that these things became very popular very quickly. Well, in a society where there is no, it took on entertainment value.
Yes, absolutely.
People could come together and watch this spectacle, and I could see why it would be popular.
Of course. And not only entertainment value, but educational value too. Of course,
yes.
Because like I said, and in no way, shape, or form is this meant to be judgmental, right? No. Critique, yes. Judgmental, no, not by a long shot.
And Jim, when I said educational, I didn't mean for that to be a critique either, but it is a social gathering place. We share ideas together. And I'll throw this in.
Yeah.
You could kind of see where there might be a little bit of inspiration to do it better next year. You know what I mean?
Of course. And that happened. And of course that did happen. Right. Yeah. But if you think about it for a minute, if you slow down and think about it for a minute, yes. So by the time you hit the 3rd and 4th centuries, the theory that Jesus is born on December 25th, that's becoming popular, right? And I don't remember it off the top of my head, but then you have what's the word I want to use? The codified Feast of the Nativity comes in with the Roman Catholic Church. So they say it is so. He was born on December 25th, and we celebrate the Feast of the Nativity, right? So whether that was 4th, 5th, 6th century when they declared that this was the official birth date, right? So now, like you said, by the time we reach St. Francis, you're looking at 500, 600, 700 years of this being the established tradition, and that no one has thought differently. And then, like I said, they did have nativity plays during the Mass, but the nativity plays during the Mass were performed by the clergy. St. Francis started out as a layman, right? He was just a guy. I mean, he served in the military, and then after he got out of the military, he wanted to pursue his life's calling of he believed he was called to preach the gospel, right? Okay, but he didn't go to seminary or anything like that equivalent at the time, right? But then he got permission to preach the gospel, and he and his followers started preaching the gospel according to their understanding. So that is what we're looking at here, no question about it. That yes, it's based on the idea that Jesus was born on December 25th, which we now know is incorrect. Plus, it was based on the notion that he was born in a cave, which we now also pretty much know is incorrect. But and I can go on a very quick rabbit trail here. The legend about St. Francis, which we don't know if it's completely true, but this was during the time of the Crusades. Okay. And he was out of the military, and I'm presuming not a fighting man anymore, but he traveled to the Bible lands during the Crusades. And he did so at a time when the Muslims were in control, and he was granted permission to visit the holy sites by whoever the Muslim overlord of Jerusalem was at the time. And the tradition is that he visited the cave, where Jesus was born, and that therefore he was doing the best he knew how.
Right.
There's no question about it. But the whole notion of the cave, that goes back to the Proto-Evangelium of James as well, which, as I've already said, and we won't go, well, I mean, we can go there if we want to. I was going to save that for another episode, but in my opinion, the Proto-Evangelium of James is utterly untrustworthy as a historical source, even for the most benign fact that you really can't rely on it for even just super simple stuff.
Well, and also to bring it into the 21st century, I mean, just the idea of fact checkers over centuries when you had limited means of communication and recording technology. I mean, you kind of can't blame them for not questioning the official story, because
of course, yeah,
that was all you had to work with. And
right. And that was the point I was going to make about the nativity plays and the fact that they did become popular, because, you pointed this out, and I was just chiming in on it, really, is the fact that, if you went to Sunday Mass and now could see a popular version of the nativity play, well, you didn't challenge that. You assumed that this is how it was done, right? I mean, this was your trusted Christian leadership teaching you what the nativity looked like. So on one hand, you can't blame people for believing that it happened this way when it really was the best information they had available to them. And as I've said so many times and in so many episodes, this is what happens when you do documentary research, is that the narrator at the beginning of every documentary, whether you're talking about, King Arthur or Wyatt Earp or George Washington or, Simon Bolivar, it doesn't matter who you're talking about. They're going to start out by saying, well, the legend goes like this, but the reality is probably a little different, So same is true with the Nativity. So for years and years and years, that was the best information they had. It's just that now we have much better information.
And your opinion of logistically how he was born, was it in a home? Was it on a rooftop? Was it in a shelter? How did you get to the place you are now on where he actually was born?
Right. Well, now this is actually one of the more recent pieces of evidence
Right.
that I have discovered. Although I will mention the fact that this is not new to me by any stretch of the imagination. Oh my word! I came across this information. At this point, it's probably almost 2 years ago now. Okay, but I came across the information that the word in the Gospel of Luke, okay, where we are told that Jesus was laid in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. I discovered that the Greek word for room, or part for inn rather, okay, is actually the Greek word kataluma. I'm going to see if I can actually get it up on the screen here. Let's see if I can do that. And let's see. Yeah, there we go. So our viewers should be able to see this. Okay.
Here we go. Okay.
There we go. See, so the Greek word for a traveler's inn is a pandokion. Okay. And that's for those people that know what this means. That's Strong's number 3829. Strong's is a concordance. It's a Greek concordance where he numbered all the Greek words to make it easier for people to look them up. Okay. So the Greek word for a traveler's inn is a pandokion, right? But the Greek word translated in Luke chapter 2, verse 6, which is the one where we're talking about in the Nativity story, that's the Greek word kataluma, which could be translated traveler's inn. It's broad enough to include that, but it is not the general meaning of the word kataluma. Kataluma is better translated guest room. Okay. And the best way to understand this is if we look at two other records in the Gospel of Luke, right? Because Luke, as the writer of his gospel, right, he's going to be consistent in his use of words. At least one would assume he would be consistent in his use of words. So does he use either of those words again, in other records, right? And he does. So when you read the story of the Good Samaritan, right? So the Good Samaritan is, there's this Samaritan man and he gets set upon by robbers and thieves and they beat him up and they leave him by the side of the road, right? And then people keep passing him by, okay? Or a certain man, it says, not a Samaritan, a certain man is traveling, he gets attacked, beaten, and he gets left by the side of the road. And then, people keep passing him by, and then a Samaritan sees him and takes him to, and it says very clearly, takes him to a traveler's inn, takes him to a pandokion, right? And in that record, interestingly enough, the innkeeper is mentioned as well. It says that he takes him to a traveler's inn and that he pays the innkeeper to take care of him and that he'll come back later to check in on him, right? So here's a record in the Gospel of Luke that clearly is using the word pandokion correctly, okay? So now another record, however, is the record where later on in Luke, where Jesus is about to send his disciples into town to find a place to have their Passover meal, okay? And he tells them, go into town, you'll meet a certain man, and the certain man will show you a room furnished and ready to use, and you will tell him the master has need of it. Well, that's the Greek word kataluma, right? So here we have it in perfect contrast where you've got a guest room or a room for rent in a private home. That's the key.
Yes.
So it may have been a room for rent. That's possible that it was a room for rent, but it was a room for rent in a private home, as opposed to a Pondokian, okay, which was literally a traveler's inn. Okay. So back to Luke chapter 2, when it says they laid Jesus in a manger because there was no room in the kataluma, no room in the guest room, that may have been a rented room, but it also simply could have been the guest room. And then when you put it in the context of the fact that Joseph and Mary were traveling to their ancestral hometown, okay, that's very, very, very important. We tend to glance over that. We don't give this the import that it really has in this record, okay? Under the Hasmoneans, there had been a very deliberate repopulation of Galilee, because Galilee was largely depopulated under the Syrians, the Greeks, that dominated the that part of Israel for starting after Alexander the Great, so starting roughly 300 BC ish, all the way up until the middle of the 2nd century BC. So for about 150 years, the Syrian Greeks dominated the northern kingdom. Okay, and Galilee had been largely depopulated. So when the Hasmoneans came into power, they deliberately tried to not only repopulate the northern part of the kingdom, but they did so with Judeans, in other words, Southerners, right?
Yeah.
People that were from the tribe of Judah. And you could actually very, very much use the word patriot. It would be completely appropriate. This would be like if you made up a fictitious scenario where if the British had won part of the revolution, right, and hadn't been run out of the country, and maybe they had maintained control of Boston or Philadelphia or something like that, but then we fought a second revolution and then pushed them out, right? If you made up a fictitious scenario like that, you would say, oh yeah, well, we finally took Boston back from the British in the second revolution, and then we would move in all these patriots, right, to occupy the country, right, occupy that land. So that is what happened in Galilee in the just prior to the turn of the century, from the 2nd century BC to the 1st century BC. It looked like you wanted to say something.
Yes, I want to jump back just here because I want to make sure that I'm understanding you correctly. So when we're discussing this most likely private home, and they were staying there, are you saying that Jesus was born in the private room, or was born in the manger because there wasn't room in the private room and maybe mom and dad stayed in there? I'm not. And one step further, are you saying these are probably friends of the family?
Yeah, I'm getting there, right? So the
Okay.
So the reason I set this up by describing this repopulation of Galilee by Judeans is to help us understand why were Joseph and Mary there to begin with. Right? That's Galilee. That's northern Israel, not southern Israel, where the tribal allotment for the tribe of Judah resides. Okay. The tribal allotment for for Nazareth would have been the tribe of Zebulun, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. And so, because you go back much, 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 much earlier, right, to 12th to 14th century BC, when the Jews came out of Egypt and then Joshua led them into the promised land, they had these tribal allotments, right? So the tribal allotment of Galilee was Zebulun. The tribal allotment for Judah was in the south. This is now, 1400 years later, depending upon which dating system you use. But we're finding Judeans. Joseph and Mary were Judeans living in Galilee. Why are there Judeans living in Galilee? Well, it was due to this deliberate attempt to re-Judaize the nation after the Syrian Greeks had defiled the country for so long. So that brings us to, why did they have to travel to Bethlehem to begin with? And we're told that there went out this decree from Augustus Caesar that all the world should be they use the word taxed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which really the better word would be simply be registered. It's not,
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't necessarily a taxation. It was really either a census
Right.
and or a registration. It may not have even really been a census, because what we have come to understand and what I believe was the case, because the Romans were experts at taxation,
Yeah.
and they were experts at taking a census. And they kept really good records, right? Now, there's
Mm-hmm.
always the possibility that we just simply can't find the record. That's the way history works. There could be an existing record that we've just never found, right? But the problem is if we go looking for a taxation or a census around that time conducted by the Romans, we can't find one. So we have to kind of expand our search parameters a little bit. And when you come to realize that Augustus Caesar, was going to be given the title Pater Patriae by the Roman Senate in 2 BC, he was going to be recognized as the father of the country. And that would have required that every notable citizen in the Roman provinces and in the client kingdoms would have had to have sworn an oath of allegiance to Augustus Caesar. So therefore, I believe that this is the registration they're talking about, right? And now it really comes together. Now the puzzle really makes sense, because you would never, in a general census, why would you require people to travel? Okay. Now it turns out that is actually what the Romans do, but it does raise a very important question. Why were they required to travel? But if Mary and Joseph were of the house and lineage of David, which you're told they were, right? They are notable citizens. They're royals. They're not just Joe Judean, right? And Judah is the royal tribe, but the house of David is the royal house. And we are told very plainly in Scripture that Joseph, we're told flat out that he is of the house and lineage of David, unquestionably. And then all you have to do is put together a couple little pieces of the puzzle and realize that Mary is of the house of David as well. That would have required them to travel to their ancestral hometown, right? So now, and also you have to ask yourself this question, because I think this is real possible. This is a pilgrimage culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every able-bodied male was supposed to travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So had Joseph made that trip before?
Of course.
You would think he had, right? Yeah. We know Mary did. I mean, when Mary discovers she's pregnant, she runs off to Judea to visit her cousin Elizabeth, quote unquote, right? So it's makes a whole lot of sense that both Mary and Joseph had made this trip before. This was not unusual. They had made this trip before. And it also stands to reason that, frankly, Joseph may have had his own property in Bethlehem. It's very possible. We don't know for sure, but it is very possible that he literally had his own property, because as a landowner from the house of David, I guarantee you he would have been someone that would have had to have made the journey to register. That would have qualified him in every sense of the way. But even if he didn't have his own property, right, they're still going to their ancestral hometown. Do they have relatives? Oh,
probably.
Of course they do, right?
Yeah.
Uncle whoever, right? Uncle Levi or Uncle Mordecai or, Uncle Moshe, whoever is probably living in Bethlehem, and they would show up and say, hey, we need a place to stay. Can we hang with you? And here's the theory that makes complete sense. They wouldn't have been the only Judeans living in Galilee that would have been required to make the trip. And since you tended to travel in numbers and you tended to travel in family groups, it's very possible that 6, 8, 10, 20, 30 people showed up and said, we all need a place to stay. So Mary and Joseph weren't the ones that got the guest room. Somebody else got the guest room, right? Yeah. But now we get to the punchline. Now we put all the pieces together, right? In a traditional Judean home, it would have been a large single room house. And in that single room is where everybody would have slept, and they would have prepared meals, and they ate there and hung out there and stuff like that. And then if you had a little extra money, you might cordon off one end of the large single room and call that the guest room. Or you could have put the guest room on the roof, as you indicated. That was also very popular, because then you could have slept on the roof, and in hot weather that would have been, extremely comfortable, right? But in the style of house where they had the large single room and then the guest room would have been interior, right? If you imagine a large rectangle, that would have been at one end of the room, right? So you're talking about a room that might have been 12 to 16 feet wide and maybe 20 to 25 feet long, right? So now you cordon off one end of the rectangle for the guest room, but then you would also cordon off the other end of the rectangle, here you go, for the household animals. Because, see, going back to our very European viewfinder for how we look at things, in Europe, they kept the animals in a stable by this time, St. Francis of Assisi. But in Palestine, at the turn of the millennium, you kept your household animals in your house. Wow. You didn't keep your animals in a stable. Only the rich had separate quarters for their animals, because you couldn't afford that, right? So your couple of cows or your few sheep or goats or whatever, you would have a door and you would lead them into a recessed area at one end of this big rectangular room. You would dig down into the earth. You'd make an area that was maybe 3 feet lower. And then at night, you just open the door and you just run the animals right in there. And this kept them safe. It kept them from being stolen. It helped keep the house warm in the winter, if it had been in winter, but just describing why they would keep their household animals in the house. But then it was on this ledge, okay, that is where they would place the feeding trough for the animals, because it made it easy. They would just stand there and lean over the ledge and dip into the feeding trough, and the feeding trough is called a manger. That's the word for it. And mangers, by the way, were made out of stone, not wood.
Okay, so let me understand this. If they're digging to make this portion of the area lower, is it just for that particular purpose of allowing the animals to feed on that one? Why was it lower?
Well, because they would create an artificial wall, and it would keep the animals contained, because you didn't just want the animals wandering around. Your entire one-room home, right? So you dig down this 3-foot recessed area, run the animals in there. It made a makeshift wall. Maybe you stacked up some stones.
I get it.
It kept them from moving around. And then out of convenience, instead of putting the manger, the feeding trough, in an area where they can step in it, because anybody who's ever dealt with animals knows that they won't eat where they poop, right? Yep. So instead of putting the feeding trough in the lowered area where they might step in it or defecate in it, now you put the feeding trough on the ledge. It makes it easier for them to get at it. It makes it easier to maintain. So now you have this completely different picture, completely different mind picture. They're not in a stable. They're in a traditional Judean home. It's overcrowded because the whole family's there from Galilee for the registration.
Everybody's in town.
Everybody's in town, exactly. And we've all been there. I mean, those of us especially those of us that have large families, which I'm from a large family, when everybody comes into town, it's like, you're cramming into every conceivable corner. People are on the couch. People are on the floor. That's how, when you're the kid, you got to give up your best room to Uncle Steve, this kind of stuff,
Tim. And you're saying, I don't mean to cut you off, but I got to know this. So you're saying that area where they're putting the food, etymologically, that word is manger?
Yes. That's what a feeding trough is called, a manger. So it's just that we've had this European picture, right? Because we've always known that a manger is a feeding trough. We've known
not
that.
Not me. Maybe I'm
okay.
I just thought, and I think a lot of people think the word manger looks like a small barn or shelter. I did
Oh,
not know
well,
that.
it's got it. Technically, it does have a dual meaning.
Okay.
Okay, so when you look up the word, the Greek word, which I forget which one it is off the top of my head, when you look up the Greek word for manger and do a word study, what you discover is that the word manger does have two meanings. The
Wow.
predominant meaning is the feeding trough, but the extended contextual meaning is the entire area, right? So that lowered area could be called the manger and you wouldn't be incorrect, okay? But that's the secondary meaning. That's actually
Mhm.
very, very clear that that is the secondary extended context meaning, that the predominant meaning is that the manger is a feeding trough. And we now know because of archaeology. See, the assumption, okay, here you go, back to St. Francis, right? He wasn't making a faulty assumption.
Right.
He was just missing pieces of the puzzle,
Right.
right? Because in Europe, the animals would have been in a stable,
Mhm.
and the feeding trough would have been made out of wood.
Mhm.
That's completely logical. That's not illogical at all. It's just not how they did it in the Middle East.
Mhm.
In the Middle East, your household animals were brought into the house at night, kept in this lowered area at the far end of the large one-room house, right? And then on the ledge is where they placed the feeding trough, which, by the way, were made out of stone, because the stone was a much more plentiful building material than wood, and also that was something the animals couldn't knock over.
Mhm.
Couldn't knock it over. So now, when you realize that the animals are at one end of the rectangle, the guests are at the other end of the rectangle in the guest room, and it's an overcrowded Judean home, and maybe it's like we said, it could even be Joseph's own home. This could literally be Joseph's own home and his own property, right? But at the very least, it's got to be an uncle or a cousin or something like that. And everybody sleeps in the large one room because that's what you did, right? Now, when Jesus would have been born, okay, oh, guarantee you the women would have shooed all the men out of the house. The men wouldn't have been in there. They would say, go out and boil water or something. You know, we need clean rags and fresh water, and you men get out of here, right? But then the women of the family, plus the local midwife, right, would have been there. And we don't know exactly where, I mean, he could have been born outside, I suppose, but every likelihood is that he was born right there in a very standard, traditional Judean home, surrounded by the women folk and the midwives, and then eventually by the men. He would have been born around loving family. They were this whole notion of them being outcasts, right? And this evil innkeeper that, said, I'm sorry, there's no
Right.
vacancy in the motel. There's the barn out back. Go ahead and use it.
Mhm.
Which, I mean, I'll go there. I have to go there. I've got to take advantage of the opportunity.
Please.
What rural agricultural society anywhere in the world, even today, would look upon a young, newly married couple, and one of them is, and the woman is pregnant, and they say, hey, and this is under the assumption she's about to pop, by the way, which
Mhm.
we now know that's incorrect too. Okay, but this takes us back to that whole ridiculous notion that they were refused shelter in an inn by an innkeeper.
Right.
What culture in the world says, oh yeah, there's nothing I can do, sorry, nothing I can do, right? There's the barn out back, go use it if you feel like it. What a jerk, right? And not only them, but apparently the whole town must have felt that way, if you believe the traditional nativity story.
Tim, okay, when you lay all of this out, to me, all of it is extremely logical, very plausible, probably what happened. Yet, as a just regular person of reasonable intellect, you're saying, so how would someone think that that could be possible? And actually, the way you lay it out, you're like, yeah, how could that be possible? But all of our lives, me in particular, you've heard this story. I grew up Methodist. I grew up in a Methodist church, and the nativity stories, all of this, there's the people who are atheistic or agnostic and they're not having it. But like for me, even as improbable as some of it might have been, I took it as this story. But when you discuss it in this way, and you're talking about, okay, just for example, how bad a person does this person have to be to turn away a man and wife, and she's possibly in labor or what have you? It is extremely improbable, yet we all kind of took it. Many of us just took
We
it
did.
for granted. We
I
accepted
swallowed
it.
it too. Yeah. I mean, I was born and raised in a a large mainstream denomination, and well, how did we open the whole show today? Right?
Right.
That the assumption was, well, the date changed, but the
Yes.
story didn't really change.
Right.
But then when you realize, wait a second, well, the date changed. It's not winter. It's not cold outside. Oh yeah. By the way, Bethlehem is at the same latitude as like El Paso. It's not cold, right?
Yeah.
Oh, so she didn't ride a donkey, right?
Right.
Oh yeah. By the way, it's the Greek word guest room, not hotel. So incrementally, so the question back at the beginning of the show was, did it just occur to me all of a sudden, or did it sneak up on me? And it was both, right? Because what happened is that, oh, it wasn't winter. Oh, it wasn't a stable. Oh, she didn't ride a donkey. Oh, she wasn't in labor when they arrived. Oh, she didn't give birth the same night. And when you start clicking away at these individual details, then they start to accumulate. And then eventually you get to a place where you go, oh my God, it's just not the same at all.
Tim, let
So
me
there you
ask you
go.
this. Because I remember one time you and I were on a call a couple of years ago, and you were telling me your ideas like about the meaning of the word manger within the context that we just discussed. How many people have or know about this idea? How are there people besides yourself that share this
Sure,
work?
of course, sir. I of course have no idea what the percentages are,
Right.
right? But I mean, I learned about this because I tripped over an author, right, who discussed it in a book, and I went, because I was aware of the distinction, right? I was aware of the
Mhm.
Greek that I had looked up on my own. I just did a word study and looked up the Greek and went, oh, well, that isn't the word for a motel. That's what's up, right?
Mhm.
So, but then as I investigated further, providentially, I discovered a source that discussed it in detail, and I went, oh my God, he's absolutely correct. And then we're running out of time, so I don't have time to do it in detail.
Sure.
But I shared with you just 4 to 6 weeks ago that I discovered that Roman Catholic priest who he discovered this during the Spanish Inquisition. Remember
Yep.
this, right?
Yes.
So
Yep.
this Spanish priest discovered this distinction, and he was a college professor, and he taught it to his students, and his students got so upset
That's
that they
right.
reported him to the Inquisition. So then, in his trial at the Inquisition, he got to defend himself in writing. So he wrote down, well, it's the Greek word kataluma, not the Greek word
That's right.
pandiokian. So ironically, it's actually part of the historical record of the Spanish Inquisition that Jesus wasn't born in a stable.
Whoo.
I mean,
That
they didn't agree. They arrested him,
Yeah.
but what a talk about irony, the
Exactly.
fact that it's actually part of the written record of the Spanish Inquisition that Jesus was not born in a stable. He was born in a traditional Judean home.
Well, the reason I ask that is just out of curiosity, like how close this information that you're discussing for the last several years that I've known you and been fortunate to be a part of. I just always wonder how close is this to breaking into the mainstream?
Well, that's a good question. And you know what? We're going to have to actually talk about that in our next episode. So
Fair enough.
let's remember that, and let's talk about that, because that's a really valid question. How close is it to breaking into the mainstream? Because obviously that's part of what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to get people to understand this, because I think, God is glorified in the truth. The truth is in the details, and your heart can rejoice when you know the truth, as opposed to having all this cognitive dissonance in your head trying to figure it out. So, Michael, thank you for being a part of this as always. So we got to
Always a
wrap it
pleasure.
up with a little bit of business here. Everybody, this is God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. You can listen to us at truthbetoldnetwork.org. Go there, click on the big listen button, and listen to not only God Save the King, but a lot of other great shows that are on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. You can also listen, like we've said before, on your Android app, on MyTuner, on Wi-Fi radio, on TuneIn Radio, and of course, Alexa, Google, and Apple Home devices, as well as being able to call in. So this is Tim Keyes. This is Michael Parker for GodSaveTheKing.org. You can listen to us at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. Michael, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Good day.